I was having a drink with my dad the other day, and he said, your show is basically we're reading Homer and screw you. By which I think he meant, like, we're reading Homer and screw all of the identity politics crazies, screw all the liberal feminism and so forth. So that's going to be the unofficial tagline for this podcast. And in this case, it's we're reading Plato and screw you. I will now also say once more, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcast to this show. It's hugely helpful when you leave a 5-star review on iTunes, or at the very least, it's helpful when you keep your bad opinions to yourself. The thing about these texts, right, is that there is so much to dig into. And in this case, we have Plato's Symposium, which is a text that I did with Michael Knowles on his book club show. And that episode's coming out soon. It's going to have stuff in it that isn't here. You should go and watch that when it comes out. It's going to be really cool. We had a great chat. But that's a half hour long. And this is the deep cut. This is like all the stuff that we didn't have time to get to. And the Symposium, which is Plato's philosophical dialogue about love, is tremendously rich. It has a multiple thousand-year history of people digging into it and discussing and talking about it. And there is just so much in it. Plus, it's 70 pages, so you can go away and read it. So here we are. Where to begin? Robin Waterfield, who is the translator of the Symposium that I'm going to be reading from. This is his Oxford World Classics edition. If you can see me, I'm holding it up, but if you can hear me, Robin Waterfield, he writes that the Symposium is living proof that a great book does not need to be a long book. And I think that's absolutely right. This is Plato, the philosopher Plato's dialogue about love and sex, but mostly love. And it's very short. It is tremendously deep. It has been the subject of endless analysis and conversation and discussion. There are parts of it, and you're probably going to realize this as we go along, there are parts of it that might have made their way into your consciousness and into your mind without your even maybe knowing about it as a text or having read it. Let's talk a little bit first about Plato and who Plato is, if you don't know him already. He is a philosopher who lived in the late 5th century and early 4th century BC. He studied under Socrates. In Greek, the word sophistes, which is what we translate when we say sophist, it comes from the word for wisdom, which is sophia. And so sophist, in its original meaning, really just means something like wise man, wise teacher, maybe guru or something. But Socrates, in his career, starts to use sophist as a slur. And I sometimes call this the most effective hit job in the history of the West, in the history of intellectual culture, because there were a lot of different people wandering about and thinking and discussing philosophy in ancient Athens. That's one of the things that was most exciting about the high classical period, which is the roughly sort of the 5th century BC in Athens, is that people were toying around with all of these new ideas. They're so excited about philosophy and the search for wisdom and the search for scientific truth and truth about the natural world. They were having a huge range of discussions. But Socrates had this criticism of the people, his sort of contemporaries, which is that basically they were hacks. There were these guys, some important ones that get named by Plato later on are Gorgias or Gorgias, Prodicus, Protagoras. You might have heard some of these names. And they were offering, in many cases, kind of self-help courses in a lot of ways. Prodicus is famous for having offered 2 different courses. You could take the 1 drachma. Drachma is a Greek coin. You could take it for basically one drachma, the cheap course, or you could take the 50 drachma course. And that was where you learned everything. You really got let in on the secrets, the mysteries of the universe. And the problem with all of this for Socrates, and we're going to get to Plato in a second, promise. The problem with all of this for Socrates is that he kind of thinks these guys are just selling, get rich, get famous, get powerful quick schemes. There were a lot of elite, power-hungry young men in Athens. And since Athens was a democracy, one of the best ways to get powerful or to attain sort of power in Athens was to get really, really good at convincing people through speech. And so Socrates basically thinks that the Sophists, as he calls them, are selling the ability to get powerful through speech, whether or not you're saying things that are true or good. Protagoras, we're told, was selling the ability to, quote, make the weaker argument appear the stronger. So, this is something we all recognize today, right? The ability to kind of make a convincing, a persuasive, and eloquent argument, even if what you're saying is total crap. And that's what Socrates basically criticizes everybody around him for. And he wants to establish himself as the guy who actually sincerely holds the key to the beautiful and the good and the true, and who doesn't charge, right? He goes from house to house. He gets meals. He's beloved among the Athenian gentry, but he famously says that, he's the only person who knows that he knows nothing. This is in his self-defense speech, the Apology, where he kind of defends himself against the charges that would eventually kill him. He says, I know that I know nothing. And so his whole kind of way of doing things is much more lo-fi, sincere, and dedicated to the pure pursuit of knowledge. Now, Socrates, this is something, again, that people have argued and talked about for a million years, but Socrates may or may not be sincere at any given moment. And to make things worse, he never wrote anything down. So there's an extent to which a lot of this stuff might just be propaganda, but there's also an extent to which, there was a lot of relativism going around in the air in Athens at this time. There was a ton of sort of political double dealing. There were a bunch of hucksters and shysters, and Socrates, via Plato, kind of starts what will become the Western philosophical tradition. Now, that having been said, there were a number of fascinating and important philosophers before Socrates. There was Pythagoras, whom you may have heard of course, and there were a number of other important thinkers. But Socrates begins this method of kind of inquiry and questioning, and sets up for us, I guess, a lot of the ideals that we have of the philosopher. That he would be sincerely devoted to truth. That he wouldn't just think that it's all relative. That there would be something kind of some profound mystery of the universe that he's actually and really trying to penetrate. So Plato studies under Socrates. He is born around 429. He lives until 347 BC. And as we said, Socrates never wrote anything down, but Plato adored Socrates and watched him both become beloved by the Athenian gentry and then get killed by the Athenian gentry, right? They accused him of corrupting the youth and undermining faith in the gods, both of which he was arguably doing. We're going to get to some of that later on. But they accused Socrates basically of unsettling the standard way of doing politics and doing life and doing religion in Athens, because he was asking all of these difficult questions, constantly getting people to kind of reframe their beliefs, think again about the things that they took for granted. And Plato grows up and learns and is educated kind of under this system of just constant questioning, of beginning from a point of thinking that you know nothing and then going basically from there. Now there's a problem. Plato comes of age in a time when writing is more and more current. Remember from Homer that writing was not always the main way that you conveyed stuff, but at this point, writing is basically a hugely important way of communicating. It's the technological advance of how to communicate your ideas. And Plato wants to get down on paper, or rather on papyrus. He wants to get down some record of what Socrates taught him and what he gathered from Socrates and everything that Socrates did to transform intellectual culture, to move away from relativism and toward truth in intellectual culture in Athens in the 5th century. But he knows that for Socrates, and in some ways for himself, true wisdom, true knowledge isn't attained through books. And this is going to surprise you, because I've probably been talking, I've been waxing poetic about how great books are and how deep their wisdom is. But for Plato, writing can't do what a deep, profound relationship over time can do. We all have, hopefully, these friendships in our lives where, each friend stimulates the other intellectually, and the friendship is part of the learning and part of the wisdom. It's not just the kind of ideas you talk about, but it's the long hours you spend out on the porch smoking cigars, drinking scotch, whatever, right? That's kind of the heart of how you gradually over time come to be comfortable in a relationship and to understand and to learn things from a friend. And in the Phaedrus, which is one of Plato's dialogues, he sort of says, that's what writing can't do. It just stands there like a statue, or like it never grows new leaves the way a living tree does. It's kind of mute and can't answer your questions. And so there's this problem for Plato, this kind of technical problem of medium, of how to get across everything that Socrates communicated to him. And that is why Plato, in many ways, ends up writing dialogues. He's famous for writing these kind of, they're almost like scripts for a play, or some of them read a little bit more like novels. And this is hugely important because Plato is an artist every bit as much as he is a philosopher. He was famous for this in antiquity, and we don't talk about this so much. In the ancient world, Plato was like the great prose stylist. There was an essayist who came around later, around 20 BC in Rome, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and he wrote an essay on composition, on sort of prose style, and he said that Plato was constantly combing and curling his pieces and his dialogues. Even unto the age of 80, he was going back and editing them meticulously and making sure he had just the right word. Cicero, the famous Roman orator, said that Plato is really the summus orator, the greatest rhetorician. And so we don't always think of philosophy this way. And it's largely because of Aristotle, whom we'll get to later, comes after Plato, and in many ways formalizes a system of kind of logic, cold, pure logic. But as Aristotle himself knew, there are also other ways to do philosophy, and important ways that, you can't always get through cold, pure logic to the kind of truths that you might want to access when you're talking about love, for example, right? The love, as they say, is a many splendored thing, right? And there's like lots to love that you need to be able to sort of discuss in a more open and discursive way. The Greek word that's important here is dialego, and the English word that we get from it is dialectic. And I'm going to say both of those words again so that you can remember them and sound smart at cocktail parties. The Greek word is dialego, and the English word is dialectic. This means conversation. It means kind of the dialogue back and forth between a number of different ideas. It has also to do with kind of, you start from received wisdom or common wisdom and what people think just based on kind of their community and their time. And then you kind of back and forth, you question whether these things are true. And that kind of engagement, that kind of conversation is one of the things that Plato captures in the dialogue form. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. You have to remember that you're not always looking for just kind of like if A, then B, and therefore C. You're looking more for just the whole sort of artistry of the description and the capturing of this life of conversation that Socrates kind of formed in this community in Athens. All right, the Symposium. The Symposium is a Platonic dialogue. It's one of the dialogues that Plato wrote to try and capture what life was like with Socrates. And it's especially profound in that way because it's a story that our narrator heard from a guy who was there. So it's like a frame story within a frame story within a frame story, right? The center, the core of this text is this kind of magical night. It's a night that glows in people's memory when everybody was called upon to give speeches about love. But our narrator hears that story from a guy named Aristodemus. Aristodemus bumps into Socrates and kind of gets invited to this dinner party or this drinking party on his own. So the year is 416 BC. That's the dramatic date of this dialogue, meaning that that's when it takes place. It's written probably somewhere around 385 to 378 BC, but it looks back 416, near the end of the 5th century. And what's happened is that Agathon, who is a tragic poet, has just won his first victory in the city Dionysia. And this was like the Super Bowl plus, a religious festival plus July 4th. It was like this big civic, religious, artistic festival. It happens every March in Athens. It's one of the cultural achievements of Athenian life. 3 tragedians write 3 trilogies, compose 3 trilogies of tragedies, and they compete for the honor of having won, and they get prizes if they win. And that's where we get our idea, distantly, that's where we get our idea of tragedy. We're going to talk more about tragedy later on. But that's what's just happened, is that Agathon, the tragic poet, has won his first victory at the city Dionysia. And because this is such a big deal, obviously you have to have a big rager afterwards. You have to have a party. And in fact, there are 2 days at least of parties for Agathon after he wins, because the Symposium takes place on the second day of partying. The first day was, I guess, maybe too rowdy or something, but Socrates sort of says in the dialogue, I didn't like the look of the crowd after the first celebration. So now I'm going to the second celebration. And the second night, they're having, presumably what they've been doing also in the first night, they're having a symposium. This takes a little bit of talking about, but it's the title of the piece, obviously, so it's important. So the symposium in ancient Athens is this kind of cultural institution. It literally means drinking together. So for one thing, it's a drinking party. You get together and you drink wine. But it's also a huge number of other things. It's obviously a social institution. It's typically kind of upper crust. It's all male, all sort of Athenian men. Athens is a very sort of gender segregated society. So it happens in the men's room, and the women are off in the women's room of the house. And you don't just drink. You sort of sit, you lie on couches. You have food brought to you, probably by slaves. There's music playing. The aulos is this pipe instrument that was played in ancient Athens. You have a slave that's playing that. You can, people at a symposium can just have sex with slaves. That happens all the time. And you can they're sort of there to gratify you. And there is, it's debauched, but it's also sophisticated. There are often readings of poetry. There are often intellectual discussions. And as we'll see, this particular symposium is especially sophisticated and actually not that debauched. And the reason for that is that everybody got so trashed the night before that they don't want to get trashed again. So Aristotle bumps into Socrates. He's on his way to this second symposium. He's wearing shoes, which is unusual for Socrates. Socrates is so kind of pure in Plato's depiction. He's so pure and obsessed with the good life that he doesn't really care that much about his personal appearance. He doesn't often wear shoes, but now he's kind of dressed up to go to this second party, this second symposium. And they bump into each other. Aristotle hasn't been invited, but Socrates says, come anyway, you're going to be my guest. I'll sneak you in. And they get there, and and Socrates has suddenly mysteriously disappeared, and it's just Aristotle. So he turns around, he's like, everybody is sort of, where is Socrates? You didn't get invited, but fine, whatever, we were going to invite you. And then, Socrates is gone. So the big question off the bat is, where is Socrates? The answer, it turns out, is that every now and then, Socrates, I love this, Socrates is such a little asshole. I don't know. There's something just tremendously obnoxious about him in an immensely lovable way. And I guess that's part of kind of what becomes clear in this dialogue, I think. So Socrates is so devoted to the good and the pure and the true and the beautiful that sometimes he just sort of stops in the middle of nowhere and stares off into space, communing with the good. And I'm joking about this now, but Plato is such an artistic genius. He folds this in because it's going to be hugely important when we get to the climax of the dialogue. But we're not there yet. So for now, just note, Socrates is kind of off in dreamland, staring into space, contemplating the truths and the mystery of the universe, but he does eventually show up. And so now we really get to the symposium, the drinking party, for real. Socrates is there. Who are the other guests? We've got couches arranged in sort of a U shape. So you can imagine that U shape if you want. And one of the interesting things about the dialogue form and about this kind of friend remembering who heard it from a friend, yada, yada, that sort of thing, is that Plato, and this is often not emphasized enough, Plato thinks that memory is really important. And when you have a dialogue that is written in this way, that's kind of, a friend heard it from a friend, you don't get the reality of being there. You can't get the reality of being there. What you get is the way that it sort of made an impression in people's memories. And so things get filtered out and certain things get emphasized. We all have this experience. C.S. Lewis writes about it, that you look back and suddenly things that you remembered from the past have this special quality that reveals more of their truth, right? You meet your friend for the first time, your best friend for the first time. At the moment, it's just kind of like, oh, hey, we've just met each other. And then you look back and it's like this tremendous, important moment when you met your best friend or the person that you're going to fall in love with and all that stuff. That's part of the effect here. So all of that is by way of introduction to saying there's a bunch of randos at this party, at this symposium that don't get named or remembered. They talk, but Aristotle is kind of like, I didn't really remember them. So the named characters are Phaedrus, who's kind of, we'll talk about each of these people because they each give a speech. Phaedrus is kind of a minor Socratic. He's in some of the other dialogues. He's sort of a philosopher and a thinker. Pausanias, who is the lover of Agathon, and we're going to get to that as well. Agathon is the poet who's just won the tragic competition, so he's obviously there. Agathon is sharing a couch with Socrates, who is there. There's Aristophanes, a famous comic poet, and there's Eryximachus, whom nobody's ever heard of except for here maybe. Eryximachus is a doctor, and he's sitting on the same couch. He's lying on the same couch as Aristotle, who's the narrator, and the narrator sort of fades into the background at this point. It's not really important. But okay, so here we are. We're at this kind of special symposium. They send the flute girl away, which means they're not going to be having sex with any slaves. They're not going to be listening to rowdy music, and they're not going to be getting trashed. They're going instead. Phaedrus and Eryximachus propose. They're going to give speeches about love. So Eryximachus says Phaedrus has often complained that love, the great god, is not praised as much as other gods. And he says there are so many speeches of praise. Speeches of praise were a big deal in Athens. This is probably a reference to that sort of culture of sophistry where people were being taught to investigate the natural world and to make these big, set piece speeches. Eryximachus says there's even a speech praising salt, but there's not a speech. There aren't a lot of speeches praising love. So that's what they propose to do. Everybody's going to make a speech praising the character of love. And when I say love, I'm not just talking about all of the things that we mean by the English word. This is something you may have heard about already. It's kind of a famous feature of the Greek language, that there are many, many words for love. I think this is a great feature of the Greek language because when we say love, we often mean a gajillion things, right? When somebody says, I love my wife, he means something quite different from I love my dog. At least we hope that he means something quite different. Or I love my friend, right? The Greek word that we're talking about here is eros, or you sometimes hear it said eros. And eros or eros is everything that we think about when we think about romantic passion. It's the desire for sex. It's the desire to be close to somebody. It's the obsession with somebody that keeps you up at night. It's the thing that keeps you checking your phone because you don't know if he's going to text you back or whatever. That's eros, right? And the real question on the table is sort of like, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me, right? It's what is eros and what is its nature? How does it work? And why is it something worthy of praise? And so we launch into the speeches. And the first person to give a speech that gets recorded is Phaedrus, who, as we said, is this kind of minor Socratic. And he gives what in some ways might be thought of as a conventional view of love from Athens in the 5th century BC. He says love is a great inspiration. It's wonderful because it teaches us shame. This is kind of interesting. The shame and honor are tremendously important in ancient Greek culture. When we did Homer back in the day, we didn't really talk about this, but that's a big motivator. Actually, we did talk about it for Achilles, right? His glory is a huge motivator. And shame, likewise, is a huge motivator. You want to avoid shame. And one of the things that Phaedrus says is that when you love somebody, you don't want to be ashamed in front of them. He says, imagine a man in love having some disgraceful action of his discovered, or being detected in a cowardly failure to defend himself against being made to accept some indignity. My claim is that being found out by his boyfriend would cause him more distress than being found out by his father, his friends, or anyone else. Now, you may have noticed the word boyfriend. We are going to get to that in just a second. But this is where you get the idea of what we sometimes call Spartan love, right? This is where it becomes famous. And Spartan love is the idea that soldiers in the ancient world would, male soldiers would be in love with each other. And that would make them, fight harder, basically, in front of one another. Phaedrus basically articulates that view. This is a real thing. There was something called the Sacred Band of Thebes, which consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers. Played a major role at a battle called the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Now, that is after, as you may have noticed, that's after Plato wrote this dialogue. So this is not a reference to the Sacred Band of Thebes. But that idea is obviously current, and that's kind of, you may have heard of this sort of ancient Greek idea. That is not a made-up thing. That is a real deal. If you have watched the movie 300, which is about the Spartan army, and you saw a bunch of underlying homoeroticism, that may also not have been unintentional. Which brings us, right, to homosexuality. This is a really gay piece of writing. A lot of the love that is being discussed, a lot of the sexual desire and love that is being discussed is between two men. I'm going to explain first sort of how that worked in Athenian culture, and then I'm going to talk about the ways in which it may or may not make us uncomfortable. So homosexuality is a staple feature of Greek life. The ancient Greeks do not think about sex in the way that we tend to think about sex. We think about sex under the influence really of two major forces. One is Christianity, and the other is Freud. And Christianity is where we get all of our sort of morals about sex, and Freud is where we get all of our kind of down and dirty impulses about sex. That's oversimplifying tremendously, of course, but neither of those things exists in this world. And so this is a very, very different world in which sex is less about gender than it is about power. And that is quite disconcerting. Now, I should preface this by saying it's not all about power, right? Obviously, love is involved in sex. That's why sex is involved in this dialogue about love. But what I do mean by this is that the male-female roles are not as important as what's called the erastes and the eromenos roles. So this is the lover and the beloved, or to get like a little bit graphic about it, right? The pitcher and the catcher, the giver and the receiver. The erastes is the active partner in a romantic relationship. The eromenos is the passive partner in a romantic relationship. And one feature of this is pederasty, which is a word you may have heard, and that is even more uncomfortably, right? Something that makes us really recoil is it's a relationship between an older man and a younger boy. It's kind of an educational relationship, but also in many cases a sexual relationship. The older man is typically supposed to be the erastes, the active lover, and the eromenos, or the beloved, is the younger boy. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. I have a lot of viewers, readers, listeners who feel a lot of different ways about sexuality, but I think it is fair to say that there is something to make everybody's hair stand on end here, right? There is something for everybody to get a little grossed out by in the way that sex operates in this sort of homosexual pederastic culture. So this is a good example for us of something that offends our sensibilities. We do not believe that older men should sleep with younger boys in the way that the Greeks seem to feel is fine. And that's important because in this podcast, part of our goal is to shrug off identity politics, which is a sort of way of thinking about texts that judges them by the standards of the present, right? We don't think that Shakespeare is feminist enough, which is a totally modern standard. And so we're going to reject everything that he has to say as being wrong and evil and bad. Judging the past by the standards of the present makes you stupid and deprives you of everything that people have to tell you that is different from what you currently think and believe. That's why I said at the beginning that the past is another country. It's actually a world where people think about things differently. So it does no good to shrug off the identity politics way of like condemning Homer for being racist or not appropriately woke or whatever, and then just condemn Plato in basically the exact same way. Let's not make the same mistakes as the identity politicians, right? We can't let our own sensibilities, which we can hold, right? We can strongly say and believe that it is wrong for older men to sleep with younger boys, at the same time as we sort of don't reject this dialogue out of hand because it contains discussion of that. I hope that makes sense. It's also important that Socrates doesn't endorse this. He's actually kind of anti-sex or dismissive of sex in this dialogue and in a few other dialogues of Plato. So, if it does make you uncomfortable, you also should know that this is not a dialogue that endorses this. It just sort of takes it for granted as a feature of the world. That is a little excursus on how to read ancient texts, because I think it's really important. It's important that we not just do the exact same thing in our conservative world that the identity politicians do in their sort of less conservative leftist world. That's all I have to say about Phaedrus. He kind of lays the groundwork for what, is what's going to be the kind of baseline view of love. So then we move on to Pausanias. Pausanias is Agathon's lover, as I mentioned. And he says, okay, so that's all well and good. It's all well and good to say, that homosexual love and love between, men inspires them to great deeds of heroism and to want to look good in front of one another. But in real life, that's actually not always how it works, right? And this is where we start to get a complication of this kind of, we start to get moral qualms about this world of pederasty. He says there's high love and there's low love. And low love is where you try to sleep with an older man for money or promotion. And unfortunately, this is actually kind of something that we are familiar with, right? Maybe not in the same particularly gendered way, but right, like, people kind of try to get with each other for all sorts of reasons besides the true passion of being with one another. And so we get this very important idea that not all love is pure and perfect, and that's going to come back to haunt us later on. It's going to become extremely important. But he says there is a high form of love in which men should be lovers in order to teach one another and learn from one another and develop one another's excellence of character. And so you get this idea kind of that there's good love and there's bad love. Not all love is ideal or pure. And that's basically, for me, that's the important part of Pausanias' speech. It's not one of the hugely major ones. Next comes Eryximachus. Now, I think Eryximachus, they pass over Aristophanes, the comic poet, because he has the hiccups, and so he needs to cure his hiccups. And Eryximachus is a doctor, so he gives him these methods for curing his hiccups. I think he says hold your breath, but eventually he gives him a bunch of different ways to cure his hiccups. And Eryximachus takes his place, and then we're going to come back to Aristophanes. Aristophanes is like the guy in the seminar who's like, come back to me later. So they're going to do that, and then so this is, to me, Eryximachus the doctor is one of the most interesting and neglected speeches. It's because it comes before Socrates' big speech, and because it's kind of in the middle, people tend to forget about it. But it does something really important. Eryximachus treats love as a kind of biological force. He says it's about emptying and filling. And here's a little passage from it. Put briefly, medicine is the science of the ways of love as they affect bodily emptying and filling. The science of medicine is completely governed by love, and so are sport and agriculture, and it takes only a moment's thought to make it perfectly clear that the same goes for music too. This was perhaps what Heraclitus, this is another earlier philosophy, what Heraclitus was getting at, though he didn't express himself well when he said, unity coheres by divergence within itself. Look at the structural harmony of a bow and a lyre. Now, the idea that there's divergence within harmony, that harmony could still exist if the components were divergent, is quite absurd. Perhaps he was trying to say that it's the job of musical expertise to bring about harmony by changing a state of divergence between high and low pitch into one where they are in agreement. Huh? What? That is like incomprehensible to me. I don't know if it's incomprehensible to you. It's not actually fully incomprehensible, but it takes a little bit of unpacking. What Eryximachus is saying here is that there are forces in the world that push toward what we might now call sort of the conservation of energy, right? That when there's some big sort of pent up, when you have a lot of bodily fluids in a certain place or whatever, they want to go to a place where there are fewer bodily fluids. The philosophy of emptying and filling, he calls it. Now, obviously, this is not scientific in the way that we sort of think of it, but what's important about it is that it does something that we do all the time, and that is to kind of materialize stuff. It says, love is basically the, physical love and sex and romantic love are basically one version of this vast sort of law of forces and movements that pervades the whole universe. And, you can see it operating in sports, you can see it operating in agriculture, and medicine is his example, right? Because medicine empties, if you're overfull, if you're, let's say you're what's it called? Your appendix is overswollen, right? We kind of take that out and we empty the part that's overfull. And he basically says, love, when you get sort of full up, not to get too graphic, but when you get sort of like full up and pent up with sexual energy, then you have to empty that out, and you move toward the thing that will let you empty it. Why is this important? It's important because it shows us that this way of thinking about the world, that it's all about kind of material forces moving back and forth, is not a new or revelatory or revolutionary way of thinking about the world. Materialism, the idea that everything is just matter moving back and forth from one place to another, is presented in our day as the new sophisticated discovery of science. We used to think that there's a soul, but now we just think that everything kind of bounces around. It's all just forces of nature. And that, people tell you that this is kind of the new thing. Old people were dumb, but now new people think this way. That is a view based on basically no understanding of history. And the only reason that people are able to act as if modern science has proven this new thing, that it's all just material, is because they've never read anything, right? Like this was pervasive in the ancient world. I could name off the top of my head Democritus, Leucippus, Epicurus, all of these ancient philosophers who have some version of like, it's all just atoms bouncing off of each other, man. So I just want to like pause with that, because that's really important. It's important that we not get swept up in this idea that you can just kind of, that the new fad that is, exciting and revolutionary and moves beyond the old ways, that new fad is materialist science. It's not the case. It's right here in Eric Zimica's speech. There's one other important thing about Eric Zimica's speech, which I'm going to mention before I move on, which is that it does introduce an important idea to the dialogue, which is that love is more than what we think of when we think of as romantic love. Even eros, which is specifically romantic passion and desire, is actually something that motivates and drives the whole universe. It's a force that kind of compels the way that everything works. And that is going to be important. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. But first we move on to Aristophanes. So Aristophanes is a comic poet. And this is one of my favorite. Well, I guess I've said that already about a bunch of them. So I guess I love all of these speeches. But Aristophanes, comic poet, this is a really good one. And it's different from all the others because he tells it in the form of a kind of mythological story. And he says, and this is a great piece of sort of wisdom and insight, I think, that is put into Aristophanes' mouth. He says he wants to be funny but not ridiculous. And, we say it's funny because it's true, right? The best jokes do have a way of kind of getting at something true. And Aristophanes tells this kind of funny story that back in the day, we used to be two people rolled into one, basically. That humans, when they were created, were these weird spherical balls rolling around, and they were made of what would now look to us like two people. So you'd have one face on one side, another face on another side. You'd have 4 arms, 4 legs, and so on. And you get kind of, male-male combinations, male-female combinations, and female-female combinations. So interestingly, there's this idea that, once you go down the line in this story, you're going to end up with lesbians and gay people and straight people. But that's kind of an anachronistic way of looking at it, because those words are modern. But in any case, you have big round people rolled up into one. And he says these people get kind of uppity. And Aristophanes says their strength and power were terrifying, and they were also highly ambitious. They even had a go at the gods. So Zeus and the rest of the gods met in council to try to decide what to do with them. They were in a quandary. They didn't see how they could kill them and blast them out of existence as they had the giants. This is another myth of the gods that killed the giants, because that would also do away with the veneration and sacrificial offerings the human race gave them. After thinking long and hard about it, Zeus said, I think I can see a way for the human race to exist, but to be weakened enough to start behaving with some moderation. What I'm going to do is split every single one of them into 2 halves. Then they'll be weaker, and at the same time, there will be more in it for us because there'll be more of them. They'll walk upright on 2 legs. If, in our opinion, they continue to behave outrageously, Zeus added, and they refuse to settle down, I'll cut them in half again, and then they'll go hopping around on 1 leg. So that's Aristophanes' story, is that Zeus got so mad at our ambition and so worried about our ambition that he cut us in two. And then we were made into the beings that we now are. And this is where we get this idea of your other half, right? That you have somebody wandering around out there that was meant to be conjoined with you. It was meant to be kind of one being with you. And that's what sex is. It's this kind of pitiful attempt to shove ourselves back together. Note that this is not the Christian view of love and sex, right? We don't believe that you're incomplete without your other half, without somebody else. And this is, but it is an ancient view that has kind of permeated the world, that that love is the way that you kind of make yourself complete, that you reunite yourself with the right person, so called. That's Aristophanes' myth. The important thing that we're going to draw from it. By the way, when I say the important thing that we draw from each speech, one of the interesting things about Socrates' speech when we finally get to it is that it kind of takes elements from each speech, even though he rejects a lot of what everybody says. There are important things that come from each. The important thing that we're going to draw from Aristophanes' speech is that love is about yearning and longing. Love is about wanting something that you don't have, looking with desire at something you might not even know what it is that you need, right? But you're wandering the earth looking for something to make you whole. That's Aristophanes. Next, we come to Agathon. Agathon is fun. Agathon is a tragic poet, so he's just won this giant tragedy contest. He's kind of, this is his moment, right? Like he's the golden boy right now. And Socrates jokes with him. He's like, you shouldn't be afraid to stand up and give this little speech about love. You've just presented in front of like a gajillion people. And Socrates exaggerates how many people would have been at the city Dionysia. But the point is, right, you've just been on national television. Obviously, it doesn't matter that you're here among friends sort of chatting. And Agathon says, no, obviously it's more important and more scary to try and speak well among a small gathering of smart people than it is to speak to a bunch of dumb people, which is this interesting thing because, right, the city Dionysia, as I mentioned at the beginning, was this gathering of all the Athenian people, this kind of big democratic gathering. And they're basically saying, well, those guys are just dumb, and we're going to get also to why tragedy is considered kind of like for the dumb masses. But then Socrates kind of turns it around on his head and he's like, well, but we were there too. We were also at the city Dionysia. So it wasn't just the kind of hoi polloi. It wasn't just the masses. It was also the smart people that you're talking to now. So there is this sense, I think, in this dialogue and elsewhere that, tragedy has its flaws. It's got, a lot. It's in many cases, it can be quite intellectually empty, but there's no escaping from it. Everybody has art. Everybody does art and is interested in art. Everybody goes to this big civic festival, even Socrates. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. Agathon speaks very, very beautifully in a way that Socrates is just going to totally reject. So this is what's interesting about it, right? He's kind of in this dialogue, he almost sounds like the sophist extraordinaire, and tragedians were kind of known for taking ideas from the sophists and incorporating them into their plays. And so Agathon says, look, I'm not going to praise love's effects because that's not how you do a real speech, a real praise speech, an encomium. The way that you do an encomium is that you praise the actual qualities of the being or the thing or the person that you're praising. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so I'm praising love himself as a god. Now, love, this is, when we think of Cupid, the little sort of child of Aphrodite, that's kind of, that's Eros. That's our modern version of Eros. So we're talking about a male god here. And he says, love is beautiful. He's forever young. He's always fair. He's always treated fairly. He's just this kind of, ideal, wonderful golden boy. We love love. Love is so great. And that's basically the point of Agathon's speech. And it's meant, and Plato, had a big beef about this. It's meant to basically show that Agathon is all rhetoric and no truth, that he's just beautiful words without any semblance of reality or meaning. And Socrates, as I've already said, Socrates is an asshole, is a lovable asshole. And so he comes in and he's like, oh, that's funny. I'm nervous because I had thought that what we were doing here is saying the best things about love that we could say that were true. But now that I've listened to Agathon, I actually know that we're just saying whatever the hell. True or not, doesn't matter. So now I'm scared because I don't actually know how to do that. I only know how to speak the truth. So he's such a dick, but we love him so much. Socrates, the character of Socrates in Plato. What a dick. Anyway, here he is. He interjects and he does this little mini. This is a much more sort of common. Most Platonic dialogues have this kind of dialectic exchange in them between Socrates and some person who thinks he knows stuff but doesn't actually know anything. And what he basically argues, what Socrates argues to Agathon before his speech, this is a little prologue to Socrates' speech, is he argues, well, look, if you love, you desire the thing that you love. And if you desire beauty, how can you desire something that you already have? You have to desire something that you don't have. And so love can't be beautiful because it desires beauty, and so forth and so on. Now, here's what's interesting to me about this. It's a bad argument, right? You could have red hair and be really attracted to other people with red hair. So you obviously don't only have to desire things or qualities that you don't have. And there's kind of a little addendum where Socrates says, well, if you want to be strong, but you're already strong, what you really want is to be strong still in the future. But it still doesn't work actually for romantic love, because you could be a strong person who desires a strong person, right? So this argument is kind of wrong, but it gets across something about love that Socrates wants to convey. It's sometimes called the deficiency model of love, that when you desire somebody, you love somebody, it's because you want something that you don't have. And that's, as I said before, that kind of comes to us out of Aristophanes' speech, right? This idea that love is about yearning and longing and desire. And so there's a good example of an argument that would not hold up in the kind of the formal logic school that Aristotle really develops, but that still in this kind of boozy, well, I guess it's not super boozy, but in this kind of evening of laughter and friendship and conviviality, it kind of gets something across, right? Which is that love is about desire, and that you can't love without feeling less like a hero and more like a beggar, more like somebody that needs. So that's the first thing that we kind of get out of this weird cross-examination of Agathon. And then Socrates moves on to his own speech. And now we have yet another level of sort of frame story, because it's not going to be Socrates who speaks directly. He's going to kind of report what he learned from this woman, Diotima, the priestess of Mantinea. And we don't know, this may or may not have been a historical figure. There's a great book about it called Socrates in Love by Armand Dangour. But we don't know, who Diotima was for sure. And for this dialogue, what matters about Diotima is she is the person who Socrates says taught me everything I know about love. And that, if you think that is a pun and a double entendre, you are absolutely right. The ambiguity is on purpose, right? We don't know what the relationship exactly was between Socrates and Diotima, but she taught him everything he knows about love. Now, famously, as I have already said, right, Socrates is supposed to not know anything. He's supposed to know that he doesn't know anything. So this already is kind of this weird, interesting paradox. But we're going to get to that, right? That love, because love is longing and need, not knowing that you know nothing is knowing everything about love, right? And then we're going to kind of develop that as an undercurrent as we go. But we get to Socrates. Socrates tells us that Diotima cross-examined him in exactly the same way that he just cross-examined Agathon, because Socrates too used to think that love was pure and beautiful and good, but Diotima was like, no, it's love is not. Love doesn't have. Love is about need and desire. And Diotima actually says love lives in the middle between good and bad, between having and not having. That love is what's called a daimon, which is a kind of intermediary between gods and mortals. He's this halfway point, not divine, not human, but kind of semi-divine, immortal, but not a god. And that's an important image, right? It's love as this kind of intermediary between the human world and the divine world. That too is an idea that comes to us from a million different sources, right? That love connects us to something bigger than itself. And so then she tells this story of love, about how love, the real myth about who love is. And Diotima says, once upon a time, the gods were celebrating the birth of Aphrodite. and among them was Plenty, whose mother was cunning. After the feast, as you'd expect at a festive occasion, Poverty turned up to beg. So there she was by the gate. Now Plenty had got drunk on nectar. These are gods, right? Or embodiments, rather, of sort of concepts. Plenty had got drunk on nectar. This was before the discovery of wine. And he'd gone into Zeus's garden, collapsed, and fallen asleep. Prompted by her lack of means, Poverty came up with the idea of having a child by Plenty. So she lay with him and became pregnant with Love. The reason Love became Aphrodite's follower and attendant then is that he was conceived during her birthday party. Also, he is innately attracted towards beauty, and Aphrodite is beautiful. Now, because his parents are Plenty and Poverty, Love's situation is as follows. In the first place, he never has any money. And the usual notion that he's sensitive and attractive is quite wrong. He's a vagrant with tough, dry skin and no shoes on his feet. And she goes on, right, that Love is this kind of shyster, trickster that has to beg or steal his money, but is, he's always in need, but he never kind of really falls off the wagon. And what's funny, doubly funny about this is that this is Socrates, right? Socrates doesn't wear shoes. Socrates never pays attention to his clothes and stuff. And that's going to come up later, that Socrates is basically, as the best philosopher, he's also the embodiment of love. Now, love, as we have said, as Socrates has said, is desire for something you don't have. And we desire good things, Socrates goes on. And we don't just want good things now, we want good things forever. Now again, this is not a good proof. This isn't like a sort of logical syllogism that works well. But there's something that we know is true about this, right? Everything that we desire, all the good things that we desire, famously are never enough, right? You really want that car, and then the minute you get the car, it's kind of like, oh, now I have this car. What's the next thing that I'm going to acquire? You really, want to have a relationship with this person, but then, after you've known them for a long time, maybe you sort of think like, well, that doesn't really satisfy the deepest longings of my heart. You hear Christians talk about this a lot, obviously, because it indicates that we yearn for something beyond physical, material fulfillment. Socrates agrees with Christianity in this respect. He says we don't just desire one good thing or a good thing for now. We desire the good forever, for all eternity. And so love is this yearning toward eternity and a desire for immortality. And that is where we get into this completely trippy section of Diotima's speech, which is about pregnancy. Now, I've just gone on this long rant about how this is mostly a gay dialogue, mostly about love, physical, sexual love between men, at least to start off with. And so what the heck are we talking about with pregnancy? Well, Diotima says, pregnancy and heterosexual procreation is part of how we fulfill our desire for eternity, because we invest we make this kind of little fake copy of ourselves in our children, and it lives on. But she says that same impulse is also what motivates intellectual relationships and intellectual production. So he says love desires the good, and it can only procreate in the medium of the beautiful. So in the most basic possible way, you're only attracted, you only want to have sex with people that you find sexy, right? That's the kind of baseline physical version of this. But she says everything is like that. When you're full, when you're pregnant with an idea or with a poem or a piece of writing or whatever, you can only produce it, you can only get it across when you feel attracted to the setting and the world and the relationships in which you're creating it. So that's, the beautiful is the condition under which you can give birth. And this is all, it sort of sounds like metaphor to us, but Diotima, I think, is quite serious, that this is a form of pregnancy and giving birth, is writing a poem or producing a play or what have you. And she actually comes right out and says, look, human children die, right? So they're not actually a very good example of preserving your life for all eternity. But look at Homer and Hesiod. Homer and Hesiod produced children that people still talk about. And we mentioned this in the Homer episode, right? That Homer's poems are still around. We're still talking about them. And so that's real procreation. That's real investing yourself in a copy of something that will gain you life for all eternity. And here now is where we get into the kind of major idea and the most famous passage, not only from the Symposium, but one of the most famous passages in all of Western literature. This idea that love, which we had a prologue or kind of an inkling of this in Eric Simicus's speech, the doctor's speech, the idea that love is not just sex. It's not just your one-on-one relationship with a person that you desire or feel romantically attracted to. It's everything. It exists animating the whole world. And she says, and there's this ladder of love, right? And it goes like this. Here's how it happens. You fall in love with a person, with one person. And that's kind of the baseline form of love for Diotima. It's like, it's almost like the kind of love that we almost share with the animals. It's like you feel sexually attracted to somebody, you desire to be with that person. That person is beautiful to you. You are in love with, you're smitten with that one person. In the case of, pederasty, it's one man falls in love with one young man, one young boy. And that desire and that sexual attraction is just overwhelming. But she says, if you're really thinking, if you want to progress beyond that phase, you have to recognize that there are other beautiful people too. And you can start to see beauty in other people besides just the person that you're passionately in love with. And if you really think hard about it, you'll realize that there's something consistent about that beauty. Even though two people might physically look different, if they're both beautiful, you're recognizing some quality that exists in both of them. And you can actually abstract out to that. And you think, well, actually, that sort of quality of beauty also exists in such things as arguments and institutions, right? You can say, oh, the church is a beautiful institution, meaning its rules and its structure and its hierarchy. I find those very beautiful in much the same way that I find, the face of my beloved beautiful. And we kind of abstract out from this and we find this beauty and this passion and this love that goes beyond just any one individual thing or argument. This is a Greek way of thinking that we don't always get at. The Greek word for the beautiful is to kalon. To kalon is like is beauty of all kinds, nobleness and goodness, right? It's not always easy for us to think in this way, but mathematical symmetry is kind of another way of thinking of it, right? Like a beautiful architectural building is symmetrical and mathematical in exactly the same way. Some certain Stoic philosophers and Greek philosophers would say it's beautiful in the same way as a human body or a human face is beautiful. And so there's this concept, this abstracted concept of the beautiful and the good, which exists sort of beyond and behind every individual thing or argument or person or idea that we find beautiful. And that is what Socrates was off staring at the beginning of the dialogue, right? Back way at the beginning when he kind of was absent from the dinner party, he was staring off into space because he was communing. He's reached the top of this ladder of love. And I'm going to just read the passage where Diotima describes what this thing is that you find when you attain the kind of love that you really find at the top of all of this. He says, what else could make, this is Diotima speaking to Socrates, says, what else could make life worth living, my dear Socrates, than seeing true beauty? If you ever do catch sight of it, gold and clothing and good-looking boys and youths will pale into insignificance beside it. At the moment, however, you get so excited by seeing an attractive boy that you want to keep him in your sight and by your side forever, and you be ready, you're far from being the only one, of course, to go without food and drink if that were possible to try and survive only on the sight and presence of your beloved. How do you think someone would react, then, to the sight of beauty itself in its perfect, immaculate purity, not beauty tainted by human flesh and coloring and all that mortal rubbish, but absolute beauty, divine and constant? Do you think someone with his gaze fixed there has a miserable life? Is that what you think about someone who uses the appropriate faculty to see beauty and enjoy its presence? Right? So this is Socrates. This is what he's reached. He's reached this ability to commune directly with the pure beauty and good and truth that lives beyond all of our individual and motivates all of our individual relationships and desires. This is what has come to be known as Plato's theory of forms, right? The idea that behind the physical world, the world that's always changing, that's always kind of unstable, there exists this stable, pure, true world of forms that are the beautiful and the good, and they are beautiful forever and to everybody, and not just relatively beautiful or beautiful in some capacity or in some way. This is, communing with the real. Now, it's a tremendously beautiful and powerful theory of love. And one of the things that it does, right, is it takes us out of that materialist way of understanding love. It says, actually, your physical desires and your romantic desires are they are physical, but they are physical expressions of something much deeper and bigger and more profound, which is our human desire to commune with the eternal, to see love, to see beauty rather, and perfection, and stare it straight in the face. You probably are recognizing a lot of stuff that Christians or modern people also believe, and that's because there's been an intimate relationship between this dialogue and the Christian tradition of thinking about love. But in a second, we're going to get to how the Christian tradition is a little bit different. But that's the sort of the centerpiece of this whole dialogue is this idea that love is this force of desire that drives us to the good and the beautiful, which lies behind and motivates the whole universe, and not just the one guy that you want to text you back or whatever. But that's kind of your first inkling of the pure and the good and the beautiful. That is not where the dialogue ends. And this is one of the I think this is one of the most genius moves on Plato's part. The dialogue does not end with this sort of tremendous and it's kind of the galaxy brain version of love. It's like the mind-blowing, revelation that Socrates has. It doesn't end there. What happens next is that Alcibiades bursts in. Now, Alcibiades was a very, very famous guy in ancient Athens. He was the son of a person named Cleinias, but he was taken care of by Pericles, the famous statesman. And he himself, Alcibiades, was the last of this very important noble line called the Alcmaeonids. So he lived around, 450 to 404 or so. And he was the it boy. I mean, man, was he, he was this sort of controversial but very beautiful and beloved statesman. Eventually, he was exiled from Athens for having performed these kind of, his opponents basically accused him of defaming certain religious statues and certain religious rites. But at this point, he bursts in from a komos, which is a Greek word for it's kind of like a bar crawl or an after party. It's like you go drinking through the streets. It's incredibly rowdy, and it's kind of the opposite of this more staid symposium. But he comes bursting in, and there's a little bit of kind of kerfuffle around his entrance, and then he sets out to explain, in the form of praising Socrates, he sets out to explain what Socrates has done to him. And it turns out that Socrates has basically ruined Alcibiades in his own estimation. Alcibiades sort of became attracted to Socrates. He thought that Socrates had some interesting ideas and maybe he could help him to become noble and virtuous and good. And so he tried to form a pederastic, a romantic relationship with Socrates. And he does all of these kind of coy, coquettish things to try and make that work. And Socrates won't buy it. He's just not having it. He kind of acts as if Alcibiades doesn't have anything to offer him in that department. And this is why I said at the beginning, right, that Socrates is really not invested. Plato's Socrates is really not invested in that pederastic world and tradition in its sort of more uncomfortable sexual aspects, because he rejects Alcibiades. It's like turning down, oh my gosh, who is it turning down? It's like turning down Denzel Washington and Will Smith and the Jonas Brothers all rolled up into one. Like he won't sleep with them. And this drives Alcibiades insane. This is a very realistic portrait, in my opinion. If you have ever said no to somebody to whom everybody else is always saying yes, there is no better way to make them utterly crazy. And that is what happens to Alcibiades. I'm going to pause now and sip my tea. You may have heard, first of all, I love this mug, USA. You can't probably see it if you're listening to me, but I have this giant mug that just says USA on it. You may have heard the expression spill the tea, like spill the gossip. And so it is very appropriate that I am now sipping this mug of tea because I am about to spill the tea about Alcibiades and his relationship with Socrates. So what happens? We talked about the erastes and the eromenos, right? The active pursuer, the lover, and the beloved, the pursued. Alcibiades is the hot young thing, right? He's supposed to be the eromenos, the pursued. And it's actually shameful in Greek society to go the other way around, for the young man to pursue the old man. But that is what happens because Socrates has such beautiful ideas and is so tremendously appealing as a philosopher and a conversation partner that Alcibiades can't get him off his mind. And he ends up slavering over this. Socrates is not a hot guy. He's kind of like a dumpy old man. But Alcibiades just is driven absolutely insane by trying to sleep with Socrates. that's the last speech in the dialogue, is Alcibiades kind of ranting about this. And what I love about it is you can see why they killed Socrates, right? This is Alcibiades is the golden hope of the Athenian democracy. He's the kind of young man that the whole society of ancient Athens exists to churn out. It exists to churn these noble, handsome, athletic boys out who will then lead the people and be talented rhetoricians, and will go maybe to the Sophists, right, and learn how to make sly, smooth arguments. And Socrates exists like just on the edges, kind of outside of that society, staring forever at the truth. And what's funny about that is both of those things are real necessities in a society. You need a machine for churning out, for educating people and for ushering young people, young men especially, into your institutions. You need these societal structures, but you also need people who are looking beyond and above those societal structures to try and penetrate the mysteries of the universe. Now, obviously, ideally, your society would reflect those mysteries, but all human things are imperfect, and all societies imperfectly reflect those mysteries. And so when the person like Socrates, who's kind of out there looking at the pure and the true and the good, is going to come up with ideas that like mess with you. So for example, Socrates is kind of very skeptical of polytheism, which is the sort of, if there is a city religion in Athens, it's a polytheistic one. And you can see that instead of taking Alcibiades and training him for how to make sort of like good showpiece speeches and be a sort of sly, smooth orator, he wants to take Alcibiades and make him a philosopher and make him look, see the true and the beautiful and the good. And this destroys Alcibiades. He can't compute. It doesn't work with him. And you can sort of see why the Athenian society couldn't handle Socrates. He was too dangerous. He threw too many wrenches into the works of their society. Now, obviously, I believe that was a terrible error on their part and that it was a great tragedy. But this Alcibiades speech makes me think about the fact that it was more complicated than just, oh, it's Socrates. Because he wasn't Socrates back then, right? He was just this guy, he called himself a gadfly, this annoying guy buzzing on the outskirts of society. He wasn't the person that we now revere. And so you can, miserably, unfortunately, you can see why they killed him. The last little segment of this dialogue is kind of a coda, where Aristotle kind of the narrator drifts in and out of sleep. And just as he's kind of waking up, he hears Socrates making the argument that the best writer of tragedy is also the best writer of comedy. And again, like I've said this now so many times, but Plato is such a literary genius because that's what this dialogue is, right? And always philosophers are famous for wanting to claim that philosophy is the best form of everything. Philosophy is the best kind of love. Philosophy here is the best kind of tragedy and the best kind of comedy. And that, I think there's a really good case for that because we've talked about the artistry of Plato. We've talked about this kind of terribly bittersweet tension in the dialogue between Socrates, the beauty of Socrates yearning for some truth beyond reality, and the comedy of the buffoonish Alcibiades, who's been just totally wrecked by that very thing, not by anything other than Socrates' beautiful picture of love and truth and goodness. So that's, one of the many reasons why this dialogue is great, right, is that bittersweet tragicomedy. I'm going to end this marathon exposition of the Symposium with one more reflection on why this dialogue is great. So people have often thought that, or talked about this dialogue as if it's basically Freud before Freud. So Freud is the famous psychiatrist, or rather Austrian psychiatrist, who thought that basically, and again, I'm oversimplifying, everything is what's called sublimation. And that means that we have all of these sexual desires, weird pent-up sexual desires, that we just shove down and out of our consciousness. And that bubbles up in other ways, like in our desire to paint, or our desire to form societies, or our desire to, whatever, to build a house. And so in many ways, much human endeavor is motivated by kind of suppressed sexual desire. And people think that that's what this dialogue is about, right? That all of our, all of our relationships, all of our, all of our teaching and professorships. This is all just a kind of excuse for not doing sex, or it's a substitute for sex. That is exactly not what the Symposium is about. The Symposium is the anti-Freud. So whereas Freud says everything is secretly sex, Plato says sex is secretly something else, right? That your physical sexual desires are just the beginning of this enormous initiation into a force of passion and love that animates the whole world. And you can feel the same way. I think some of us have felt this, right? You can feel the same way about longing to know great truths that you can about longing to be with somebody that you're really passionate about. Now, Plato thinks that once you get to those higher loves, you basically kind of just leave the body behind, that the body is just the first step toward this purer communion with the forms. Christians and moderns don't think that. What Christians tend to think is, yes, your love, your physical love, your sex, your desires are the first step, or the physical version of this vast cosmic force, which is love. And love, we believe, is of God. And love is God. God is love. But we don't therefore think that you should leave the body behind, because we think that the body is where everything lives. And that's why Christians take sex and the morality of sex so much more seriously than Plato does in this dialogue. Plato's sort of like, well, sex, maybe you fall in love with a young boy, but that's really like not the most important thing. But for Christians, it's like, well, no, once you get to that cosmic love, you then are supposed to embody that in your real physical life in the world. Your physical material life is the space where all of that truth and goodness and beauty has been poured by God into this one jar of clay. But Plato is great because he points us toward that love, right? He does not say, as Freud does, that all of our, sort of fantasies about beauty and truth are just sort of disguised sex. He says sex is beauty and truth and love and goodness in disguise. It's a totally different and radically transformative thing. If you want to hear me talk more about that part, about Freud and Christianity and all that, you should watch this Michael Knowles episode when it comes out, because I think we had a really great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing the version of it that they produce. People have been asking, by the way, whether they need to read the piece before they come to this podcast, whether you need to read the text or the dialogue or the play or the poem or what have you before you listen. And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. In fact, the point of this podcast in many ways is to be the thing that you encounter before you go off and listen and read. Of course, if you've already read the books, I hope there'll be stuff here for you as well. But look, they say that the past is another country. And one of the things about reading old books is that they often come kind of surrounded in all of these ancient assumptions that are not our assumptions. And they take for granted this whole cultural milieu, which means that you sometimes need a little bit of introduction, a little bit of education and learning to just get to the headspace where these texts are going to land on you right, where they're going to land on you in the way that the author intended. And that is one reason, for example, why it's good to read introductions to classic works. But introductions often come with a lot of the identity politics crap that we're trying to just leave at the door in this podcast. So hopefully this podcast is another way, not just to give you some interesting historical information, but also to situate you in the way of thinking about these texts that will make them land for you in the way that ideally they ought to land. That brings us to the end of this lengthy disquisition, this episode on the Symposium. You could keep going. I mean, you could really do a 5-hour episode, a day-long episode. You could spend a whole lifetime, multiple lifetimes, talking about this text. I hope that you will. I hope that you will go away and read this if you haven't already, or reread it. I have now reread it like approximately 20 times, and it always delivers more. It always takes... This is one of the things, actually, about the dialogue format, is not just that it's supposed to contain some kind of recollection of what it was like to be in conversation, but it's supposed to function like a conversation partner. So you're supposed to come away from it with questions, think about those questions, go back to the dialogue, refresh your questions, review everything that was there. I've never read this I've never read this and not thought, oh man, I never noticed that. I have friends who have told me that they have read this aloud with friends, and I would imagine it's awesome that way. I'm going to try and do that. I would recommend doing it. But all of this is just by way of saying, the point of this episode is you can do this forever, right? You can dig into a 70-page text if it's good enough, sort of indefinitely. We're going to stop there. As I always say, if you like this show, there is a high probability that you're going to like the other very smart and interesting people who write at the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind. Somebody asked me on, I think it was an Apple iTunes review, somebody asked me how he could donate to Claremont. We do take donations. We're always grateful for donations over there. It's not a massively funded shop, and we rely on people to help us out, even though thankfully we do have very generous and kind donors already whom we love. We are always welcoming donations. The best way to do that is to go to the Claremont Institute website, and there is a little button on the top that says donate, and you can do it there. So that is my plug to do that. Thanks so much for joining us. I love being here with you guys. We will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.